Perfito. Vamos manter exatamente o padrão que você definiu para o canal, aproximadamente 4.000 palavras, dividido em duas partes, parágrafos longos, narrativa corrida, sem subtítulos, tom cinematográfico, personagens ficticios inseridos em contexto histórico real e voltado ao público americano e veteranos. Titulo: How America's Greatest Soldiers Crushed Hitler's Last Gamble Battle of the Bulge. Part 1. What if I told you that Adolf Hitler's final attempt to change the outcome of World War II depended on one simple belief, that young American soldiers would panic, retreat, and abandon each other when faced with overwhelming force? What if I told you that instead of collapsing under the weight of one of the largest surprise offensives of the entire war, those same Americans stood their ground in freezing forests, fought surrounded for days, and shattered Germany's last realistic hope of stopping the Allied advance? This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army and one of the defining moments of the Second World War. While the campaign, locations, commanders, and military operations are based on real history, the story follows a fictional squad of paratroopers whose experiences represent the courage, sacrifice, and determination displayed by thousands of American soldiers during the winter of 1944. By the end of this story, you'll understand why many historians consider this battle the moment Hitler lost his final chance to alter history and why the men who fought through the snow-covered forests of Belgium are still remembered as some of America's greatest generation. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which World War II battle you believe best represents the fighting spirit of the American soldier, and if you enjoy true military history brought to life through cinematic storytelling, make sure to subscribe because every week we uncover another incredible story inspired by real events. By December 1944, victory seemed almost certain for the Allies. American, British, and Canadian forces had broken out of Normandy months earlier, liberated Paris, and continued driving east toward the German border. Newspapers back home predicted the war in Europe might be over within a few months, and many soldiers believed they would soon celebrate Christmas with the knowledge that Hitler's empire was collapsing. Yet inside Germany, Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. Against the advice of many of his own generals, he secretly prepared one final massive offensive that he believed could split the Allied armies in half, capture the vital port of Antwerp, destroy the fragile alliance between the United States and Britain, and force the Western powers into negotiating peace. Hitler understood that Germany could no longer win a prolonged war of production against the overwhelming industrial might of the United States, so he gambled everything on one bold surprise attack. If the offensive succeeded, it might buy Germany precious time. If it failed, the Third Reich would almost certainly be doomed. The chosen battlefield was the Ardennes, a region of dense forests, steep hills, narrow roads, and isolated villages stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg. German commanders believed the terrain was too difficult for a major offensive and assumed the Americans considered it a quiet sector where inexperienced units could recover after months of fighting. That assumption worked in Hitler's favor. Thousands of German soldiers, hundreds of tanks, artillery batteries, and armored vehicles quietly assembled behind the front lines while strict radio silence prevented Allied intelligence from realizing the scale of the coming attack. Hidden beneath thick forests and protected by winter weather, entire armored divisions waited for the signal to move. On the American side, many frontline units noticed increased enemy activity but believed it represented only localized patrols or small defensive adjustments. Few imagined that more than 200,000 German troops were preparing to launch one of the largest surprise offensives of the entire war. Among the American units occupying the Ardennes was a fictional platoon from the 101st Airborne Division, temporarily resting after months of hard fighting in France and the Netherlands. Within that platoon served Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, a 28-year-old squad leader from Ohio whose experience reflected that of countless non-commissioned officers responsible for keeping young soldiers alive under impossible circumstances. Donovan had earned respect not because he spoke the loudest but because he always placed his men before himself. He knew every soldier's strengths, weaknesses, fears, and ambitions. Private Tommy Harris dreamed of becoming a schoolteacher after the war. Corporal Jack Sullivan carried photographs of his newborn daughter that he had never met. Medic Robert Ellis rarely talked about himself, preferring to focus on caring for everyone else. Radio operator Frank Morales possessed an uncanny ability to remain calm no matter how chaotic the battlefield became. Together they represented America itself, young men from farms, factories, cities, and small towns brought together by a common purpose that stretched far beyond individual backgrounds. They joked around campfires, complained about the freezing weather, traded coffee for cigarettes, and counted the days until they believed the war would finally end. During the evening of December 15th, snow began falling across the Ardennes with increasing intensity. Thick clouds covered the sky, limiting visibility while icy winds swept through the forests. The miserable weather grounded much of the Allied air power that had dominated previous campaigns, but few American soldiers considered that significant. They welcomed the relative quiet, believing the enemy lacked the strength to launch any serious offensive. Donovan walked the defensive line one last time before attempting to rest. He reminded sentries to remain alert, checked machine gun positions, and reassured several younger paratroopers who were experiencing combat fatigue after months at the front. Somewhere beyond the darkness, however, thousands of German engines remained silent, waiting only for the first artillery shell that would signal the beginning of Hitler's final gamble. At precisely 5:30 on the morning of December 16, the silence disappeared in an instant. More than 1,000 German artillery pieces unleashed a devastating bombardment across the American front. The ground shook violently as shells exploded among command posts, supply depots, communication lines, and defensive positions. Telephone wires were severed almost immediately, radio operators struggled to establish contact through overwhelming interference, and entire units awoke to explosions before realizing they were under attack. Donovan was thrown from his bunk as the first shells struck nearby. Within seconds he was shouting orders while explosions illuminated the forest with flashes of orange and white. Trees splintered into deadly shards, snow mixed with dirt and smoke, and confused soldiers rushed toward fighting positions without knowing exactly what they faced. Before the bombardment even ended, reports began arriving from neighboring sectors describing columns of German infantry advancing behind tanks unlike anything seen since the Normandy campaign. As daylight slowly broke through the heavy clouds, American observers finally saw the true scale of the attack. Long columns of German soldiers emerged from the forest supported by Panther and Tiger tanks, assault guns, armored half-tracks, and self-propelled artillery. Veterans who had survived previous campaigns immediately understood that this was no local counterattack. It was a full-scale offensive designed to smash through the Allied front before commanders could organize an effective response. German officers believed speed would guarantee victory. If they could overwhelm the inexperienced American units defending the Ardennes before reinforcements arrived, they could drive west toward the Meuse River and ultimately reach Antwerp. Many German soldiers had been told that American troops lacked the determination to withstand such a massive assault. Propaganda officers assured them that once the attack began, frightened Americans would abandon their positions and flee. It was a dangerous miscalculation that would soon cost Germany dearly. Donovan's platoon received orders to delay the German advance for as long as possible while higher headquarters attempted to understand the rapidly changing situation. They occupied defensive positions overlooking a narrow road that wound through thick pine forests, one of the many routes German armored columns needed to use if the offensive was to maintain its momentum. Engineers quickly placed explosives beneath a small bridge while machine gun teams established overlapping fields of fire. Every soldier understood they could not stop an entire army, but they could force it to slow down. Minutes later the first German reconnaissance vehicles appeared through the falling snow. Donovan waited until they were fully committed before giving the signal. The bridge erupted in a violent explosion that sent steel, wood, and armored vehicles crashing into the frozen stream below. Almost instantly American machine guns opened fire while riflemen engaged the stunned German infantry from concealed positions among the trees. The initial ambush bought precious time, but it also revealed their location, and within moments German artillery responded with terrifying accuracy. The next several hours became a brutal contest of endurance. German infantry repeatedly attempted to outflank the American positions while tanks blasted apart trees and bunkers with high explosive shells. Donovan moved constantly between foxholes, encouraging exhausted soldiers, redistributing ammunition, and helping the medic evacuate the wounded despite the relentless shelling. Harris, who only days earlier had joked about spending Christmas at home, calmly knocked out an approaching armored vehicle with a bazooka before diving back into cover as machine gun rounds tore through the snow around him. Ellis treated wounded men while shells exploded so close that dirt and frozen branches covered both patients and medic alike. Morales finally established intermittent radio contact with battalion headquarters, only to learn that similar attacks were unfolding across the entire Ardennes front. Everywhere American units were fighting desperately against overwhelming numbers, and everywhere the Germans expected the line to collapse within hours. Instead, isolated groups of American soldiers continued resisting from villages, forests, crossroads, and frozen hillsides, forcing the German timetable further behind with every passing minute. By late afternoon the battlefield had become almost unrecognizable. Thick smoke drifted between shattered pine trees, abandoned vehicles burned beside snow-covered roads, and the once quiet forest echoed continuously with artillery, rifle fire, and exploding tank shells. Donovan's squad had already suffered casualties, ammunition was running dangerously low, and food and medical supplies were becoming scarce. Yet despite the overwhelming pressure, nobody spoke about surrender or retreat. Every man understood that the longer they delayed the German advance, the more time other American divisions would have to reinforce critical positions deeper behind the front. Unknown to Donovan and his men, countless other American soldiers were making exactly the same decision across the Ardennes. Small groups that had every reason to withdraw instead chose to fight, forcing German commanders into costly delays that slowly unraveled Hitler's carefully prepared offensive. As darkness settled once again over the frozen Belgian forest, Donovan looked toward the distant flashes of artillery on the horizon and realized the battle they had expected to last a single morning was only beginning. Somewhere ahead, the town of Bastogne would soon become the center of one of the greatest stands in American military history, and his squad was about to be drawn directly into its defense. Part 2. The freezing nights of the Ardennes tested the endurance of every man who wore an American uniform. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, fresh snow covered destroyed vehicles and abandoned equipment, and the wounded fought not only against their injuries but also against the bitter cold that seemed determined to finish what German artillery had started. Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan and the survivors of his squad marched through the darkness with little food, dwindling ammunition, and almost no sleep, following orders to reinforce the crossroads town of Bastogne. None of them fully understood why this small Belgian town had suddenly become so important, but senior commanders knew that nearly every major road in the region converged there. If the Germans captured Bastogne quickly, their armored divisions could continue west with far greater speed, keeping Hitler's offensive alive. If the Americans held it, the entire German timetable would begin to collapse. Every exhausted mile the paratroopers marched through the snow carried them closer to one of the most legendary defensive battles in American military history. When Donovan's men finally reached the outskirts of Bastogne, the situation was already deteriorating rapidly. Thousands of German troops had pushed around the town from multiple directions, surrounding the American defenders and cutting most supply routes. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by elements of several other American units, immediately began transforming the frozen countryside into a defensive fortress. Foxholes were dug into frozen ground that was almost impossible to penetrate. Machine guns were carefully positioned to cover open fields and road intersections. Anti-tank weapons were hidden behind stone walls, barns, and hedgerows where they could engage German armor at close range. Engineers laid mines across likely avenues of attack while artillery officers registered firing coordinates despite the constant threat of enemy shelling. Donovan watched his men work without complaint even after days of continuous combat. No one expected comfort anymore. Every soldier understood that surviving depended entirely on preparation, discipline, and the man standing beside him. German commanders believed Bastogne would fall quickly. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans inside the town were exhausted, undersupplied, and completely surrounded. Confident that resistance would soon collapse, German artillery opened a relentless bombardment designed to weaken American morale before the final assault. Hour after hour shells exploded across the defensive perimeter, destroying buildings, setting vehicles ablaze, and shaking the frozen earth beneath every foxhole. Medical stations overflowed with casualties while ammunition stocks steadily declined. Snowstorms prevented Allied aircraft from flying, leaving the defenders without meaningful air support or resupply. Food became scarce enough that many soldiers survived on minimal rations. Medical supplies were stretched to their limits. Blankets were shared between wounded men. Even basic necessities like dry socks became precious. Yet despite these conditions, morale refused to break. Donovan noticed something remarkable among his squad. Instead of complaining, the soldiers focused almost entirely on helping one another. Someone always found a way to share an extra blanket, a spare magazine, or the last cup of hot coffee. Under unimaginable hardship, their sense of brotherhood only grew stronger. On December 22, German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce carrying a written demand for surrender. They confidently informed the Americans that their position was hopeless and warned that continued resistance would only result in unnecessary destruction. Inside Bastogne, senior American commanders gathered to consider the demand. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, serving as acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, reportedly responded with a single word that would become one of the most famous replies in military history: nuts. When German officers received the written response, they were initially confused, uncertain whether it was an insult or an official military message. It quickly became clear that it meant exactly what the Americans intended. There would be no surrender. Donovan heard the story spread through the defensive positions within hours, and for the exhausted soldiers it became something far greater than a clever response. It became a symbol of exactly why they continued fighting. They had not crossed the Atlantic, liberated countless towns, and sacrificed so many friends to surrender now, especially not during Hitler's final desperate gamble. The German assaults intensified almost immediately after the surrender demand was rejected. Waves of infantry advanced through snow-covered fields while Panther and Tiger tanks attempted to smash openings in the American defensive lines. Donovan's squad occupied a position overlooking a narrow approach where visibility was limited by dense pine trees. Shortly after dawn they heard the unmistakable sound of tank engines echoing through the forest. Moments later dark silhouettes emerged between the snow-covered trees. German infantry followed closely behind the armor, believing sheer weight of numbers would finally overwhelm the defenders. Donovan waited until the lead vehicles entered the kill zone before giving the order to open fire. Machine guns erupted simultaneously while bazooka teams engaged the tanks from concealed positions. Mortar rounds exploded among the advancing infantry, forcing German soldiers to seek cover as American riflemen delivered disciplined, accurate fire. The battle quickly descended into chaos. Tanks blasted apart trees that had stood for generations while snow mixed with smoke, dirt, and shattered branches. German commanders had expected frightened defenders. Instead, they encountered determined Americans who refused to yield a single yard without exacting an enormous price. Throughout the day the attacks continued from different directions. Each assault forced the defenders to adapt, reposition, and improvise under constant pressure. Donovan moved repeatedly between positions, encouraging younger soldiers whose faces revealed both exhaustion and determination. Medic Robert Ellis worked continuously despite having barely slept for days, treating wounded men in freezing foxholes while artillery shells landed nearby. Private Tommy Harris destroyed another German armored vehicle after allowing it to approach within dangerously close range, understanding that waiting until the last possible moment greatly increased the weapon's effectiveness. Corporal Jack Sullivan, clutching the photograph of the daughter he had never met, calmly coordinated machine gun fire that repeatedly broke up enemy infantry assaults before they could reach the American lines. Every man understood that individual acts of courage meant little unless they contributed to the survival of the entire unit. They fought not for glory but for each other. While the defenders endured relentless attacks on the ground, conditions above the battlefield finally began to change. After days of heavy clouds and snowstorms, the weather unexpectedly cleared on December 23. Blue sky appeared for the first time since the offensive had begun, and with it came one of America's greatest advantages. Soon the distant rumble of aircraft engines echoed across the Ardennes as transport planes escorted by Allied fighters crossed over Bastogne. Hundreds of parachutes blossomed in the cold winter air, carrying desperately needed ammunition, food, medical supplies, winter clothing, and fuel directly to the surrounded defenders. Donovan watched as soldiers cheered while racing across snowy fields to recover supply containers before German artillery could destroy them. At the same time, American fighter bombers began attacking German armored columns, supply convoys, bridges, and artillery positions that had remained largely untouched during the days of poor weather. Hitler's carefully timed offensive depended upon speed, and every destroyed fuel truck, every disabled tank, and every bombed road slowed the German advance even further. As Christmas approached, the strategic balance shifted steadily in favor of the Allies. Additional American divisions poured into the Ardennes from every direction. Experienced commanders rapidly organized counterattacks while General George S. Patton executed one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers of the war, pivoting his Third Army northward with extraordinary speed to relieve the defenders of Bastogne. On December 26, the leading elements of Patton's forces finally reached the town, opening a narrow corridor through German lines. When news spread that American tanks had broken through, exhausted soldiers embraced one another despite the continued shelling. Relief had arrived, but the battle itself was far from over. German forces continued fighting fiercely for several more weeks, yet the momentum had changed forever. Hitler's offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. Precious fuel had been wasted, irreplaceable veteran troops had been lost, and Germany no longer possessed the resources necessary to launch another major offensive on the Western Front. For Donovan and the surviving members of his squad, the end of the battle brought little celebration. Too many friends had been left behind in frozen forests, ruined villages, and snow-covered fields across Belgium and Luxembourg. As they walked through the aftermath, they passed destroyed German tanks abandoned beside roads that had never reached their objectives, shattered artillery pieces buried beneath fresh snow, and long columns of prisoners marching into Allied captivity. The scale of Germany's defeat became increasingly clear. Hitler had committed some of his finest remaining formations to a gamble that depended upon breaking the American army's resolve. Instead, he discovered exactly the opposite. Isolated companies, scattered platoons, and exhausted squads repeatedly delayed, disrupted, and ultimately stopped one of the largest offensives the German military had ever attempted. Their courage bought time, and that time allowed the full weight of Allied strength to come crashing down upon the attackers. Historians often describe the Battle of the Bulge as Hitler's last great gamble, but from the American perspective it represented something far more important. It demonstrated that the United States Army had matured into one of the world's most capable fighting forces, able not only to launch powerful offensives but also to endure overwhelming surprise attacks without breaking. The determination shown by the defenders of Bastogne and countless other units throughout the Ardennes became part of the legacy of what Americans proudly remember as the greatest generation. They proved that discipline, leadership, and unwavering loyalty to one another could overcome even the most desperate enemy offensive. Hitler had believed American soldiers lacked the will to withstand such a test. The frozen forests of Belgium gave him his answer. What do you think? If you had been standing in those snow-covered foxholes at Bastogne, knowing you were surrounded with limited food, ammunition, and medical supplies, would you have found the strength to hold the line? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy cinematic military stories inspired by real battles, true acts of courage, and the incredible history of America's fighting men, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and turn on notifications because here on A Veteran's Tale, there are many more unforgettable stories from history waiting to be told.